In a perfect world, all of our devices, our printers and our monitors and our screens and our phones, would all be able to display and print all of the colors that the human eye can see. But they can't. In fact, not only does each device display a subset of colors, the different devices display different subsets of colors. Or to put it another way, if we think of a device as being able to represent a certain number of crayons, then different devices not only have different numbers of crayons, right? Some might only have this many while others have more, but they also have different colored crayons. So one might have just one blue while another has 5 different blues. There are many reasons that different devices display colors differently. One of them is technology. So take a screen, for example. It uses an additive process to represent color, where adding equal parts of red, green, and blue actually creates white. While as a printing technology is going to be using a subtractive color technology, where printing cyan, magenta, and yellow are going to create black. Another reason for the difference is that not all screens nor all printing technologies are created equally. So manufacturers use different materials of different qualities to meet the needs of different consumers. So keeping in mind that different devices can display different colors, we need to figure out how many colors we need to work with when creating and editing our images in Photoshop so that they can contain the colors that we want to show across all of the devices that we're outputting to. In order to do so, we're going to take a look at 4 different color spaces: sRGB, Adobe RGB, ProPhoto, and CMYK. So if we imagine that this color shape on the left here represents all of the colors visible to the human eye, of course, it doesn't, but conceptually, it's going to give us an idea of the relationship between the 4 color spaces. So here, this triangle that we can now see is representative of the RGB color space. It's a relatively small color space in comparison to the color gamut of the human eye. But most screens can display all of the colors in the sRGB color space. So it's a good color space to work in if you know that you're only going to publish to the screen. But sRGB isn't typically the best color space for editing images because most images captured by digital cameras or even phones contain far more colors than the sRGB color space. Therefore, converting to and working in the sRGB color space would most likely discard a significant number of colors in your images that you might want to work with. And with fewer colors, we don't have the headroom to make large color and tonal edits to our files without negatively impacting the quality of the image. So let's take a look at the Adobe RGB color space. This is a larger color space than sRGB, and most high-quality computer monitors can display all of the colors in Adobe RGB. It's the most popular color space because of the additional colors or headroom that we need when we make edits. And almost the entire Adobe RGB color gamut can be printed by inkjet printers, especially those with 6 or more color inks. The only drawback to working in a larger color space is that when we do convert images down into the sRGB color space to publish on screen, for example, there might be shifts in some color ranges as the image is reduced down into the smaller color space. All right, let's take a look at ProPhoto. When we look at ProPhoto, we can see that it is even larger than the Adobe RGB color space, and many people, especially photographers, work in ProPhoto to take advantage of that higher quality color data when they're processing their files. However, because the color space is so large, you might not be able to accurately see all of the colors on your screen, which may lead to surprises such as color shifts and banding when converting an image from ProPhoto into a smaller color space. We also just need to look at CMYK, so we can see that the color space used to output files to a conventional printing press is really quite limited. And while in the past some designers may have worked in the CMY color space because their work was only going to be output to a printing press, Today, it's a much less popular workflow since so much of the content that we create is repurposed for display both in print as well as on screen. To set your color space in Photoshop, we'll choose Edit and come down to the Color Settings. You'll notice that the working space by default is sRGB for the RGB working space. Now, if you're a photographer, then you may want to choose Adobe RGB or ProPhoto. It just really depends on your workflow. If you're designing for screen, you might want to go ahead and leave this as sRGB. So throughout the course, I'll be working in the Adobe RGB color space, meaning that all the files that I'm giving you, those exercise files, are in Adobe RGB. And you can change this here, or you can actually just leave it, because you'll notice under the color management policies, the default in Photoshop is to set them to preserve the embedded profiles. So if you are opening a file that starts in Adobe RGB, even though we're working in the sRGB color space here, the file will actually remain in Adobe RGB. And it's important to note that if you're coming from Lightroom or Lightroom Classic, the default files that Lightroom hands off is actually in the ProPhoto color space, so just be aware of that. So I'm just going to cancel out of here, and let's move to Bridge for one moment. Again, I'm going to double click on this raw file, the DNG file, to show you that you can use the hyperlink at the bottom of the preview area in order to select the color space that you want Adobe Camera Raw to hand off the file to when you decide to open that in Photoshop. So there we go, an overview of the 4 most common color spaces in Photoshop. As you work with more and more layers, one of the things that happens is that your layers panel might get a bit out of control. So in order to organize your layers, you can use layer groups. Not only do groups help you organize your layers, you can also move all of the layers in a group at one time. You can change the opacity and blend modes. You can even mask all of the layers or create special effects by adding layer effects to groups. So I'm going to start by selecting all 4 of the layers in my layers panel. If they're not selected, just click on the strawberries layer and then hold down the Shift key and click on the tomatoes layer, and that will select all of the layers in between. There's a lot of different ways that we can create a group. We can click on the folder icon at the bottom of the layers panel. That's going to create a group. Or I can use the keyboard shortcut Command G on Mac or Control G on Windows. That creates a group, and it places whatever was selected into the group, but it does close the contents of the group. So in order to see the contents, we can just click on the disclosure triangle there. I'm also going to rename this group. I'll just call it Small Photos. And I know that it might seem like a little bit of overkill to always be renaming your layers and your layer groups, and it does take a little bit more time, but if you're working in any kind of collaborative environment and you're going to hand off your files to another artist or a production team, or even if it's just you that has to revisit the files later on to make changes, it really is to your advantage to keep track of all of your layers. All right, so with the group selected, if I select the Move tool and turn off the Auto Select option, well, with the group selected, you'll notice that I can quickly move all of the layers within that group. Now it's time to add a logo to this image, so I'm going to use Bridge to double click on this logo.psd file, and it's going to open up, and it's actually two different layers. So there's an ellipse layer, which is the circle, and then there's this text layer, but it's not actually text, it's a shape. And the reason it's a shape is because I wasn't sure what fonts you would have installed. And so instead of allowing for font substitution, I just turned the text layer into a shape layer. So I want to put both of these layers into a group. I will select them both by holding down the Command key on Mac or the Control key on Windows and selecting them, and then again using Command G on Mac or Control G on Windows. I'll double click on Group 1 and just rename it to Logo. Now I want to see both of my open documents, so I'll choose Window, Arrange, and then Tile. And I'll drag the logo group into the harvest image, but I might want to look at what's targeted in the harvest image. So I'll select it. We can see that the small photos group is targeted. So if I return to the logo and drag and drop it, holding down the Shift key, it's actually going to place it within that group, which is fine because we can change the stacking order of groups. I just wanted to point out that it might be advantageous to look at where you're going to drop the images when you're adding additional layers. All right, let's close the logo.psd file. To take the logo group out of the small photos group, I can just click and drag it. Now I need to drag it not on top of it where I see the cyan outline all the way around the small photos group, but a little bit higher so that I just see the one cyan line. And then I can release the cursor, and now my logo group will be removed from that small photos group. Now I want to change the opacity of the logo, and I can do that in a variety of different ways, depending on whether or not I want to decrease the opacity of all of the layers in the group or just a single layer. So I'm going to use the disclosure triangle to show the contents of the logo group, select the ellipse, and then I can use the opacity slider in the layers panel by either clicking on the word opacity and dragging to the left to decrease the opacity or dragging to the right to increase it. I can select the text entry area and then enter in like 50%, or I can use the drop-down menu and use the slider. But I actually think it's easiest because I have the Move tool selected. I can just tap like the 8 key, and that will give me 80% of opacity on my layers panel. In fact, if I type quickly like 56, it'll give me 56%. Now, if I tap 0, it'll go to 100%, and if I tap 00 quickly, it will give me 0%. But I'm going to put it back to 80, so I'll tap the 8 key. If I wanted to change both the text and the ellipse at the same time, then I could target the logo group and change the opacity. With the logo group selected and the Move tool selected, I'll go ahead and just drag that up a bit in the image area and make sure that it's centered there using the Smart Guides to help me. Now, when I brought in all of these small images down here along the bottom, they were all the correct size, but they're also squares. And what if I wanted to change them into circles? Well, I'm going to select the Frame tool and then choose the second option here to create an ellipse or a circle. And I'll start with the strawberries layer, so I'll target it. And the way I need to draw with this is I need to imagine that I'm drawing a rectangle, so I'm looking at the upper left-hand corner. So I'll click here and then start dragging down to the right. And it actually looks like it's dragging out a square or a rectangle. But when I release my cursor, sure enough, I get an oval or a circle. I'll move to the peppers layer, and then I'll click and drag out again. You can see that I'm using the Smart Guides in order to help me snap to the edges of each one of these photographs. So at this time, I'll go ahead and do a file save as again. I'm going to save it to my computer, and I'm going to go ahead and check this Don't Show Again and choose Save on my computer. If I did want to save it in the future to a cloud document, I could select that right here. But let's go ahead and just rename this to O2 as a Photoshop document in that same folder with layers. I'll go ahead and click Save, and there we are. If I close this using Command W on Mac and then use Command Tab or Control Tab to go to Bridge, we can see there's that Harvest 02 file. Three of the most commonly used filters in Photoshop are the Unsharp Mask, the Smart Sharpen, and the High Pass filters. They're all used to help prepare our images to look their best when they're printed or when they're viewed on screen. Let's take a look at these different filters to see when we might want to use one over another. Now I'm going to zoom into 100% using Command 1 on the Mac or Control 1 on Windows, just so that I can see the effect of the filter at 100%. In order to apply them non-destructively, I'll choose Filter and then Convert for Smart Filters. Then I'm going to make 2 additional copies by using Command J on the Mac, Control J on Windows to duplicate the layer. I'll target the layer 1, the bottom layer, turn off the visibility for the other layers, and we'll just rename this USM for Unsharp Mask. Then from the Filter menu, I'll choose Sharpen and Unsharp Mask. There are 3 options here: the amount, the radius, and the threshold. The amount is the amount of contrast that we're going to be adding to the image, because sharpening really is just a trick. It's a way to fool your eye into thinking that your image is sharper by adding contrast along the edge of an object in an image. So as I increase the amount, we can see the added contrast along the edges in the image. Now the radius determines how many pixels on each side of an edge the amount is added to. So when I bring this down, we barely see any effect, but as I increase the radius, every time Photoshop finds an edge, it's now going to add this amount to almost 4 pixels on either side of the edge, and we'll start to see this haloing effect. Then we have the threshold slider. And the threshold slider is meant to suppress the sharpening in the areas of an image that don't have as much contrast. So maybe skin tone, or in this case, in the smaller areas of each one of these portions of the succulent. So as I bring that over, we can see that they get smoother. All right, so obviously this is way too much. I'm going to bring down the amount slider. Let's try it somewhere around 100. Bring down the radius somewhere between maybe 1.5 and 2. Now, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see that effect once the video is compressed, so I might just bring it up for the sake of the video to somewhere like that. Again, I think that's going to be a little bit overkill if I was actually going to print. That's going to be a pretty thick radius, and we're probably going to see that halo effect. But for now, I'll click OK, and let's move to the next layer. Now, this layer I want to apply Smart Sharpen, so I'll rename it to Smart. And then from the Filter menu, I'll choose Sharpen again, but this time Smart Sharpen. So Unsharp Mask has been around for a really long time. So Unsharp Mask is still the most popular method to sharpen, but Smart Sharpen, although it's newer, it actually has quite a number of distinct advantages. So under the hood, the edge detection in Smart Sharpen produces far less in the way of those halos that I was mentioning when you increase the radius and you increase the amount. And there's also a broader range of sharpening that's available, so you have a little bit more control with Smart Sharpen. At the top here, we have the same 2 options here. We have the amount, which is the amount of contrast, and the radius, which is how many pixels it's being applied to. But below that, we have a reduce noise option. And under that, we can tell it what to remove, either a Gaussian blur, a lens blur, or a motion blur. So Gaussian blur is going to remove a blur that's not due to noise or motion. So say, for example, you went in and you transformed your image and you rotated a little bit. That's going to soften the image. That's a little bit of a blur. And the Gaussian option can help sharpen that kind of blur. The lens blur is going to try to sharpen a blur or remove a blur that's caused by a lack of depth of field. And the motion, when we select that, we actually have an angle slider so that we can determine the angle of the blurring that we're trying to remove. But for this example, I'll move it back to the Gaussian blur. And underneath that, we have an option for shadows as well as highlights that have a fade and a tonal and a radius setting. So the fade determines how much we're going to suppress the amount of sharpening that we've added above in those shadow areas. So if I bring the fade amount down to the left, it's really just saying, hey, just fade it a little bit. And then the tonal width could say, just in the very dark shadow areas, because there might be a lot of noise there. Or I might say, nope, go ahead and fade it up into those mid-tone areas. And then the radius is going to determine how many of the edge pixels is actually going to be affected by that fade. And we have the same options there for the highlights as well. If you find that you're using Smart Sharpen often with the same settings, you can also choose to save a preset, and then it will appear here on the list. All right, for now, I'll leave it at that, and we will move to the third option here, which is the high pass filter. So we'll just rename this HP for high pass. And from the filter menu, this time we want to go down to the other option and then choose high pass. The high pass filter is another powerful way that we can sharpen images. It's actually an edge detection filter, and anything that it detects as not being an edge, it's going to turn to gray. So as I move this up to the right, we can see that it's actually getting more and more realistic, or it looks more and more like the image. I really want it to not have those soft edges, so I'm going to bring it down somewhere between 2 and 3. Of course, the great thing is I can apply this, and then because it's a smart filter, just like all the other ones, we can change the settings as need be. But I'll leave it down to 3.4. Click OK. And then in order to remove this gray, I'm going to use a blend mode. So to the right of the high pass filter, I'll double click on the icon there. And then for blend mode, I can either choose the overlay blend mode, which will give me a little bit more contrast, or I can choose soft light, which will give me a little bit more of a subtle effect. In this case, I'll choose overlay, click OK. And then if I need to go in and make changes to any of these filters, I can double click on the filter name. In this case, I'm just going to bring it down a little bit. It's a little bit too strong for the monitor that I'm viewing it on. But again, it's going to depend on how much this video gets compressed and how you're viewing it. Maybe you're just on a phone, in which case you may not be able to see it as accurately. So I would highly suggest that you experiment around with values on your own. So there you go, several different ways to sharpen your images depending on the look that you're trying to achieve. Photoshop's ability to work with layers is definitely one of my favorite features, so let's take a look at how we can master the Layers panel in order to easily work with multiple images in a single document. I'm going to start by creating a new document, and I want it to be 2600 pixels by 1625, And I'm going to have it be 300 pixels per inch in Adobe RGB. I'll go ahead and create that. And then I'm going to return to Bridge here, and I'm going to open my grapes image and the greens image. So I'll select one, hold down the Command key on Mac, Control key on Windows, and select them both. Then I'll use Command O on Mac, Control O on Windows to open them. Now, in a previous video, we set up keyboard shortcuts for Window, Arrange, and then Tile, so we can use those, Command-Shift-T, or we can select it from the menu. I want to move both the greens and the grapes into my untitled document, so I'll select the Move tool, and I find it easiest to drag and drop from the Layers panel. So the greens document is targeted, so from the Layers panel, I'll drag the background onto the untitled document and then hold down the Shift key before I release my cursor to drop it into the center. Then I no longer need the greens image open, so I'll close that. Now I want to do the same thing for the grapes, so I'll click in it in order to target it, and from the Layers panel, I'll drag and drop it into the untitled document, again holding down the Shift key and then closing the grapes file. Now, if you didn't hold down the Shift key and your image came in somewhere else, not to worry, you can just use the Move tool in order to reposition it. So let's take a look at our Layers panel for a moment. We can see Layer 1 and Layer 2. Well, let's go ahead and rename them by double-clicking on them. And then I'm going to type in grapes, and then I'll go to Layer 1, and this will be my greens layer. So we can target layers by clicking on them, and we can also toggle on or off the visibility of layers. And it doesn't matter really which layer you have selected when you toggle the visibility, because the selecting of a layer and the toggling the visibility of a layer are independent of one another. All right, let's hide both the grapes layer and the greens layer, and we can see the background layer. In fact, if we hide the background layer, we can see transparency. That's this checkerboard here. I'll go ahead and toggle back on the visibility of the background layer. Now, the background layer is unique. There's three things that you can't do. You can't change the stacking order. So I can't move the background, say, on top of the greens layer in the Layers panel. You can't reposition it, so I can't move it around on the canvas. And it can't have transparency. So if I use like the eraser tool, it would just erase to the background color. But the easiest way to convert the background into a layer is to click on the lock icon. Now I can change the stacking order by just dragging and dropping it in the Layers panel. I can reposition it if I need to by using the Move tool and dragging it around in the canvas area. And if I were to grab something like the eraser tool by tapping the E key or selecting the eraser tool, I could now erase, and wherever I paint, we can see the transparency below. Okay, let's undo that by using Command-Z or Control-Z on Windows. Now, I only want the greens and the grapes layers to appear in the upper half of the image area. So you want to show your rulers. If they're not showing, just use View and then select Rulers. And before I start dragging out my guide, I want to make sure that my rulers are set to percent so that I can quickly set a guide at 50%. So if your rulers are set to inches or to pixels, just Control-click on Mac or right-click and select percent. Then drag from the ruler area into the image area. You can see in the heads-up display there by my cursor that I'm at 50%. I can also look at the rulers for reference, and then I'll just release my cursor. Now, I'm going to target the grapes layer as well as show its visibility. I'm going to select the Move tool to reposition it, and just reposition it up a little bit. Now, if you hold down the Shift key, it will constrain it to move either horizontally or vertically. So I'll move that up. And now, even though this is a permanent change, I'm going to select my Marquee tool and then start at the intersection of the guide and the left side of the document and click and drag out a marquee. You don't have to be exact at the bottom of the grapes. We can drag that as large as we want because we're going to delete this whole area. And the easiest way to do that is just tap the Delete key. Then we can deselect that by choosing Select and Deselect. Now, like I said, that is a permanent deletion of those pixels. So if I wanted to get them back, I would need to do so now. If I save the file and close it and then open it up, I can't even use history to get them back. I'd have to bring in that file again. But that's okay for now. But let's look at a more flexible way we can do this. I'll hide the grapes layer by clicking on the eye icon to toggle its visibility, and then click on the greens layer. So instead of using the marquee tool, I'm going to use the frame tool. There's two options. You can do a rectangle or an ellipse. I'll make sure that I've got the rectangle selected. And instead of selecting the area that I want to get rid of, I'm going to drag the cursor or the frame over the area that I want to keep, in this case, the top area. We can see in the Layers panel that I have a new icon. I've got an icon for a frame as well as the contents of that frame. I can select either one of them using the Layers panel, or we can select them in the image area. So right now the frame is selected. If I wanted to change the size of the frame, I could just drag down on one of those anchor points, or we could use any of the corner anchor points in order to make it larger or smaller. For now, I'll just leave it the same size, but what if I want to reposition the contents within the frame? Well, I can select the contents in the Layers panel, but if I reposition it right now, the frame and the contents are going to move together. And instead, I'm just going to double click near the edge of the frame. When I do that, it's going to deselect the frame and just select the contents. So now I can reposition those contents within the frame. And you can see this blue outline here is actually the size of the greens layer that I'm repositioning within that frame. All right, so I like it right about there. Okay, now all I'm going to do is save this file because I've put enough effort into it that I don't want to lose it. I'll choose File and Save As. I want to save it to my computer, and I'm going to name it Harvest. I'll save it into the Layers folder as a Photoshop document with my layers and click Save. Then if I return to Bridge, we can see that new document. There are a variety of file formats that you need to familiarize yourself with when you're working with images in Photoshop. To simplify the number of file formats, I'm going to divide them into three areas of the workflow: the original source or capture files, your working or master file formats, which will most likely be like your multi-layered, retouched Photoshop files, and your output files, which are created for specific output devices. We'll start with image capture. So when you start with a photograph, the most common file formats are JPEG and RAW. JPEG is currently the most widely used file format in photography, and it's the default file format that most mobile devices, such as your phones, capture, and it's almost always an option for digital cameras. Its popularity is based primarily on the fact that JPEG files are really small, so you can store a large number of photos on a single device or card, and they can be written to those devices very quickly. However, in order to decrease a photograph's file size, the JPEG file format throws away information through a process called lossy compression. The quality of a JPEG file can range greatly depending on how much information is thrown away. Unfortunately, on some devices, such as mobile phones, we don't have a lot of control over the amount of compression applied to the images. On most higher-end cameras, there will be several quality levels to choose from, but you're still throwing away information. So while the highest quality setting, or the least amount of compression, might be unnoticeable to the eye in most circumstances, these files have significantly less flexibility when making adjustments such as brightening shadows or darkening highlights in an image after capture. So when given the option, I would choose not to capture in a lossy compression format like JPEG, but in a RAW format instead. Now, RAW is a generic term for a file format traditionally used to describe images that are captured by digital cameras and, more recently, mobile devices. The primary difference between JPEG and RAW files is that the RAW file formats contain all of the data that the sensor captured. RAW files still apply compression to files, but they do so using a different type of lossless compression so that the quality of the image isn't compromised. This gives RAW files significantly more flexibility when we're making those edits and enhancements to the images because there's more information to work with. Most camera manufacturers have their own proprietary RAW file formats, and because they're all written differently, the extensions for those files will be different. For example, Nikon uses .nef, and Canon uses .crw, and Sony uses .arw. But they still fall under the generic blanket term of a RAW file. The digital negative, or the DNG file format, is also another RAW file format, but it has a significant difference. It's not proprietary. The DNG format was created by Adobe with the intent of DNG becoming the archival format for all digital images. Adobe makes its file specifications available to other software developers, and not only do several camera manufacturers capture directly into the DNG format, it's also now available on several mobile devices. In addition, any RAW file from any manufacturer can be converted to the DNG file format using Lightroom, Camera Raw, or the free Adobe DNG converter. The next group of file formats are used to save what I'll refer to as working files or master edited files, and they're used when saving multiple layered documents from Photoshop, and they're the TIFF and the PSD file format. So the benefit of saving in either of these formats is that they're both available to save all of the things that you can create in Photoshop, including layers and masks, type and shape layers, smart objects and paths, and more. Although both formats use compression, it's lossless compression, so the quality of the image isn't compromised. Some people prefer to save TIFF files because TIFF is a more widely used file format and because it can save large files up to 4 gigabytes. I typically save my images as PSD, but that's only because TIFF wasn't as robust of a file format when I started working in Photoshop, but that's just a personal preference. The last group of file formats are used when it comes time to output and share your files for a specific device. In most instances, you'll want to save a derivative or a copy of your image, resize and optimize for that device. To reduce the file size, these file formats are often flattened and they compress the image, making it easier to upload or transfer the files more quickly. Exporting or saving a copy allows you to return to your working file or the master edited file if you need to make changes to individual layers or masks at a later date. When sending images to a color lab or a service bureau to be printed, it's best to ask what format they prefer. Ideally, they would request a flattened TIFF or PSD file in order to maintain the highest quality possible, but it's often faster and therefore more desirable to upload or transfer and print JPEG files. But if you do send a JPEG file, just be sure that the quality setting remains high. Now, when you're saving files to view on a screen, such as a phone or a computer, or posting online, JPEG is again the most common format because of its ability to create small files that download quickly. There are also some specialty file formats. PNG is a popular file format to save graphics for the web that require a single layer or flattened file but still need to display transparent areas. For example, the transparent areas around a round logo or maybe a button that has rounded corners. The PNG format will render smooth edges around that transparency so they won't look jagged. And it's most commonly used for graphics like a logo or more flat-looking artwork rather than a photograph. Now, the GIF or GIF file format is also a single-layered flattened file format. It has lossy compression applied to it, but in a very different way than a JPEG file. When you save as a GIF, you have to convert your file to a different color mode called index color, which only allows 256 colors. This file format is also commonly used for graphics like logos or more flat-looking artwork. Although the GIF file format supports transparency, it only supports one level of transparency, which means that if you have that circular logo, those edges are going to look jagged. But because of the GIF's ability to contain an animation within the file, today they're often used for creating ad banners or other short animations to view on screen. Photoshop also supports several popular video file formats, including .mov files, H.264, and DPX for working with audio and video in Photoshop's timeline. The Photoshop PDF file format is another specialty format, which is really convenient when you need to distribute a secure document. For example, you might need to send a client a set of images of an unannounced product, and it's critical that no one else open that document. The PDF settings enable you to password protect the file, not only from being opened, but also from being printed. All right, that wraps up this overview of the most important file formats that you'll run across when working in Photoshop and why you would choose to use one format over another. Now that we know what the histogram represents, we should take a look at one of the most common ways to change the tonal values in an image, and that's using a levels adjustment layer. First, we'll make a global change to extend the dynamic range of the photo, and then we'll add a local adjustment to the painted sign area here in the building. So if we look at the histogram, we can see that this image doesn't take advantage of the full dynamic range. So I have no real blacks in the image, nor do I have any whites. So from the bottom of the layers panel, I'll click on the adjustment layer icon and add a levels adjustment layer. We can see in the properties panel that we get a histogram and that it looks like the same histogram as we see in the histogram panel. We can start by clicking the auto button if we want Photoshop to automatically extend the dynamic range of the histogram for us. But if we look at where the black point and the white point triangles are, we can see that anything to the right of the white point and anything to the left of the black point have actually been clipped. So Photoshop is going to clip a small percentage of the pixels in my image to pure black or pure white. And that's typically because there might be just some little small abnormalities in the image, like a specular highlight, where it's going to say, okay, I'm making a judgment call, that can go to pure white. But of course, we have control over all of that. If I use the flyout menu and I choose the auto options, Or if I just hold down the Option or the Alt key and click on Auto, now I get all of the auto color correction options. So we can try these different algorithms or different ways to correct the image. If I choose the Enhance Monochromatic Contrast, Photoshop's just going to set the black and white points for me, and it's actually doing that for each channel identically, so we won't get any changes in color. If I use Enhance Per Channel Contrast, it's actually going to go into each channel, like your red, green, and blue channel, and it's going to clip each one of those histograms. And so you can actually get some color shifts if you use this option. Now, finding the dark and light colors, Photoshop's actually analyzing the image, and it's using the colors that it finds in the dark areas and the light areas for the shadow and highlight colors. So again, it might change the colors in your shadows and highlights. And the Enhance Brightness and Contrast, well, it also analyzes the images, but it's not going to cause any color shifts. So we can select any of these and just see how they look. We can also choose to enable the Snap Neutral Midtones, which will try to take the values that are in the midtone of your image and remove any color cast from them. So we can click through them and see if we prefer it with or without. And remember, I mentioned just clipping a small percentage. These are the values that it's clipping, so 0.1%. Of course, you can go in here and change these if you prefer a different auto setting and then save it as defaults, but for now, I'll just cancel out. I'm going to reset the auto options by clicking on the reset icon in the Properties panel and show you how to do this manually. If I hold down the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on Windows and start dragging the black point slider here, we can start to see part of the image appear, and it's going to do so in different color values. So as I bring this over, as soon as I start seeing like that yellow area down at the bottom right, that tells me that that area is being clipped to pure black, but it's only in one of the channels. So it's not until I actually see black in the image in the preview area there that I'm actually clipping all three channels to black. So really, it just depends on whether or not you want detail in the windows, if that is important to you or not. For me, I would move this over, but I don't want to move it over so far so that I start seeing black, for example, in this area. I want detail, so I'll just back that off a bit. All right, then I'll hold down the Option and the Alt key and do the same thing on the right-hand side. Again, paying attention to where in the preview I get a white preview because that tells me that it's clipping all to pure white. So I'm going to back off on that because I certainly don't want that door area here or the sign area here to be without detail. All right, now we also have a middle point slider here where we can adjust the gamma of the image, making it lighter or darker. And here's the interesting thing. If we compare the histograms now that we've made changes to them and I've set my black and white point here, we see the result of that in the histogram panel. And you'll notice that there's a bunch of gaps in this histogram. That's because I'm working with an 8-bit image, and the 8-bit image was flat. So when I expanded the dynamic range, it had to take those values and expand them across the entire histogram. And that's why I'm getting these gaps. If I was working with a 16-bit image, we wouldn't see those gaps as evidently because there would be more data to work with and more information and more color and tonal values to shuffle around. And that's why people work with 16-bit, so they can have that additional overhead when making edits. All right, let's toggle on and off the visibility. So that was before and that's after. I think you can see that the image is looking a lot better. It kind of pops with that additional contrast. Now let's zoom in. I'm going to use Command plus and then use the space bar so that we can see the sign area. Then I'll make a quick selection with my polygonal lasso tool. I'll just click on the corners here where the building's been painted. We could always go in and refine this later, but for the sake of brevity, let's say that's what we want to select. So this time when I add my second levels adjustment layer, Photoshop will automatically convert that selection into a mask. Now we can see wherever I make changes, it's only going to be visible where the mask is white. So in this case, not only do I want to make that area a little bit darker, I also want to change the color. And I can do that by using these individual channels. If I go into the red channel, for example, and move it over to the right, I'm actually adding the opposite of red, which is cyan. If I want to make it more red, I can move it over to the left. Now I'm using the midtone slider, but of course I could also go in with any of these sliders and make changes. I'm just going to quickly select green, and then again, moving to the left would make it more yellow, but moving to the right is going to kind of give it a little bit more of a magenta cast because magenta is opposite from green. So not only can we use the levels adjustment layer to change the tonality of our image, we can also go in and change the color. Now, in order to soften the edges, I will click on the mask icon and add just a small feather. And then I would go in here and probably make a little bit more accurate selections than I'm going to make right now. But again, for the sake of time, I'll just quickly select these window areas where there's a little bit of a levels adjustment, and I don't really want it to be because, of course, these windows weren't actually painted. So I'll select those areas quickly, then choose Edit. We can fill that. I'll fill it with black, deselect, and then just grab my paintbrush here and get a little bit smaller of a brush, again, making sure that I'm painting with black and just paint it out of that upper window area. All right, so here's a little before and after. And if I zoom out using Command 0 on Mac or Control 0 on Windows and hold down the Option key and click on the eye icon next to the background, there's a before and after using both of the adjustment layers. So there you go, an easy way to improve an image by increasing the dynamic range, as well as enhancing and drawing attention to a specific area using an adjustment layer with a mask in Photoshop. Photoshop has a number of tools to help us make selections in order to draw and paint and mask objects and make changes to isolated areas of the image. The most common selection tools are the marquee tools and the lasso tools, so we'll start with those. There are two different marquee tools, the rectangular and the elliptical marquee tool, and they both have the keyboard shortcut of M. We'll start with the rectangular marquee tool, and I want to use this template to draw all four of the window panes. But instead of drawing each one individually, because then I would have to think about how I could align them perfectly, I'm going to start dragging out the first rectangle. And then I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom so that I'm selecting all four of the window panes at one time. Because with the rectangular marquee tool, as well as the elliptical and all of the lasso tools, there are options to add to, subtract from, or intersect your selection. So in this case, I want to subtract from the selection. So I'll choose the third icon here. You can see that my cursor now has a minus on it. And I will click and drag and basically select the areas that I want to remove from my selection. And this will ensure that the left and right hand sides of these window panes are in alignment. Then I'll do the same thing here. I'll click and drag with the subtract from. So now I'm just left with these four window panes. In order to fill them with a color, I'll use the layer menu and choose New Fill Layer, Solid Color. I'll give it a name, Window, click OK, and then select a dark blue using the color picker. Now we'll hide this temporarily so that we can continue using the background layer as our template. All right, let's go ahead and switch to the elliptical marquee tool. I want to drag out a circle. The thing you have to know with this is that as you're dragging, it's going to drag from the upper left-hand corner. So you have to imagine, for example, that there's a horizontal line going along the top of the moon and a vertical line going along the left side of the moon, so that when you click and start dragging out, it will drag from that top left-hand corner. Now, if you didn't get it positioned exactly correctly, don't worry, you can hold down the space bar as long as you haven't released your cursor in order to reposition the point of origin for any of your selections. Then just release the space bar and you can continue dragging out to make it larger or smaller. We can also hold down the Shift key if we want to constrain it to a circle, and the Shift key also works for the rectangular marquee tool if you want to constrain it to a square. You can also drag the rectangular or the elliptical marquee tools from the center if you hold down the Option key. So remember, I started dragging from right about here, so with the Option key down, it's actually dragging out from the center. But I don't want this in this case, so I'm going to release the Option key and just drag out a circle about the size of the moon. Now, if all those shortcuts were too much, don't worry. You can always use the Select menu and choose Transform Selection. And as you transform the selection, it's only transforming the marching ants. It's not going to transform the actual pixels underneath it. All right, I'll apply that transformation. And then instead of using the layers menu to add a fill layer, I'm going to use the adjustment layer icon and add a solid color fill layer. I'm going to fill it with white and click OK. But that gives us a full moon, and it also deselects my selection because it's turned the selection into a mask. But I can always load that selection again, either by choosing Select and then Reselect, or by command clicking or control clicking on Windows on the mask itself. Once I have the selection, I can position my cursor within the marching ants and just reposition it because I want to cut this area out of the full moon so that I'm left with the crescent. In order to do this, I need to look at my mask. Where the moon is visible, the mask is white. So I just need to fill that with black, which I can do so by going Edit and Fill and filling this with black. All right, I'll deselect by using Command D or Control D. And now let's switch to the lasso tools. I'll select the polygonal lasso tool and just zoom in a little bit and use the space bar in order to reposition the tree in the image area. Now, the way this tool works is that all I need to do is click every time I want to change directions. So it's a very easy tool to use. It's going to draw a straight line between each one of my clicks. So just a few more here, and I will be all the way around the tree. When I get to the starting point, I get the little icon of the circle that tells me I'm going to close that selection. From the bottom of the layers panel, I'll add another solid color fill layer. I'll get a dark green color for that tree and click OK. Then we'll scoot over and I'm going to switch from the polygonal lasso tool to just the regular lasso tool. And here I'm going to draw a free form shape around the shoulders. This doesn't have to be exact, but you'll notice that I started on the lower left, and that's because when I get to the lower right now, I can just release my cursor and Photoshop will automatically close that selection. Then we'll add another solid color fill layer. In this case, I want it to be a little bit darker blue than we had for the windows, and click OK. I'll hide that layer so that we can see the hair. And in this instance, I want to switch to the magnetic lasso tool. Now, the great thing about the magnetic lasso tool is that it's going to try to trace an object. So it's looking for edges, and when it finds an edge, it's just going to trace along there and it's going to set down all of these points. Now, sometimes it can go astray, in which case you can actually click to set down points and kind of override where it's drawing. And the other thing that you can do, if it ever gets away from you and like starts laying down points somewhere you don't want it to, just tap the delete key and start moving your cursor back to those areas where you don't want the points. And every time you tap the delete key, it will delete one of the points. All right, so let's just continue along here, dragging down, and then let's bring it all the way back up and around the top of her head. I'll close the path. That will make a selection. Now we'll add another fill layer, solid color, and I might just make this a little bit brown and click OK. And I'll zoom out using Command 0. All right, let's show the window as well as the figure right here. That was color fill number 3. And if we needed to, we could turn off the template. Of course, that gives us our transparency. So we'll add one more solid color. We'll make it kind of a darker gray, and then just reposition it on the layers panel by dragging it down in the stacking order. So as you can see, the marquee tools are great for selecting your geometric shapes, and the lasso tools are great for your more freeform shapes. And of course, you can use any of these tools in combination with one another to make more complex shapes. We're going to take the next few minutes looking at the most popular color modes in Photoshop and the role that bit depth plays in their ability to store information. So bit depth specifies how much information is available for each pixel in an image. The more bits of information per pixel, the more values are possible and the more accurate tonal representation can be achieved. So in this example, we see an image that only has a bit depth of 1. It can only display 2 possible values, black or white, and as a result, bitmap images are not very common when working with photographs. Now, if we increase the bit depth to 8, then our images can contain 256 possible tonal or color values. There are 3 common types of files that are all considered to be 8-bit, but have very important differences based on the values that they contain and the number of channels. The first would be a grayscale mode image. An 8-bit grayscale image can have 256 possible values, but it's limited to 1 channel. In most instances, 256 shades of gray represents an adequate number of tonal levels to display what would appear to be a continuous black and white, or I guess more accurately, a grayscale photograph. The second mode is index color. It's similar to the grayscale mode in that it can contain 256 possible values, but in this case, those values are colors, not shades of gray. Like grayscale mode, index color is limited to a single channel, and this helps keep the file size down, but in most instances, index color mode is unable to display a large enough spectrum of colors to render a continuous tone photograph. Now, in this video, it might look like this is a continuous tone photograph, but if you had an image that had a lot of different colors in it, you would start to see a dither pattern, or you just wouldn't see all of the colors being represented accurately. Index colored images are primarily used when the file size needs to be very small. For example, if you're creating an ad banner or another type of image to post online. Now, the third color mode is RGB. So similar to the grayscale and index color modes, an RGB image can have 256 possible values. But the difference is that an RGB image has 3 channels to store this information, a red, a green, and a blue channel, whereas the previous color modes were limited to 1 channel. So if you have 256 possible values for each channel, then you can have over 16 million possible color values. So you take the 8 bits times the 3 channels, and you end up with 24 bits of data for each pixels. So in most instances, an 8-bit RGB image can represent continuous color in a photograph. However, 8-bit images obviously don't represent all of the tonal levels or all of the colors in the world. There are certainly values that aren't represented, which can result in an inaccurate representation of a scene. In addition, the quality of an 8-bit image can decrease rapidly when making large changes to color and tonality in post-processing. So to help solve this problem, we can work with both 16-bit grayscale and 16-bit RGB images. So a 16-bit grayscale image can contain over 65,000 shades of gray, far more than the 256 values per channel possible in the 8-bit grayscale image. And 16-bit per pixel RGB images will have over 65,000 possible values for each channel. So literally trillions of colors to work with. But it's always good to remember that this far exceeds both our ability to perceive color as well as the number of reproducible colors. So why do we need 16-bit? Well, if we look at this original image and we look at the histogram, which is something we'll be talking about more in depth in later videos, we can see that it's nice and smooth. But if I'm working with an 8-bit file and I need to make a big change to, for example, lighten up the image, I get these gaps in my histogram, which are areas where there's no values. Whereas if I'm working with a 16-bit image and I make that same change, I don't see those gaps in the histogram. So I have a lot more latitude when I'm making edits in 16-bit. Now, I should also mention that Photoshop does support 32-bit images, and they're sometimes referred to as high dynamic range images, but they shouldn't be confused with the popular high dynamic range imaging or HDR imaging techniques that photographers are using today to basically blend multiple exposures of the same scene into a single raw file using software such as Camera Raw or Lightroom. Because those files, even though they're called HDR, they actually have a maximum bit depth of 16. So the HDR 32-bit images, those are used by industries such as film and gaming, and they're true 32-bit images, and they're created when they render like 3D objects or other computer-generated imagery for special effects. Now, 32-bit files can get very large, very fast, and since not all of Photoshop's features are available in 32-bit, and because most output devices don't support 32-bit images, these 32-bit images are typically converted to 16-bit or 8-bit at some point in the workflow. Now, let's see where we can control our bit depth in Photoshop. First, when I use File and then New, on the right-hand side, I can choose between creating an 8-bit, 16-bit, or 32-bit image. I'm going to close out of this, and let's move to Bridge. If I click on this JPEG file, well, we'll notice in the metadata area that the bit depth for JPEG files is 8-bit. So if I open this image into Photoshop, it will open as an 8-bit image. If, on the other hand, I double-click on the flower.dng file, which is a RAW file, it's going to bring it up in Camera Raw. And at the bottom of the preview area, I've got a workflow hyperlink. If I click on that, we can see that I can choose what bit depth to open this image into in Photoshop. If you're working with Lightroom or Lightroom Classic, by default, they're set up when you choose to edit in Photoshop to open those files as 16-bit. So I'll open this image as a 16-bit image. Like I mentioned, it will be larger than the 8-bit image, but I'll have more editing flexibility. And if I ever needed to change the bit depth, I could choose Image and then Mode, and then convert from 16-bit to 8-bit. This is also where I'd convert from RGB to grayscale. And we mentioned the index color as well as the bitmap modes. Well, I'd actually need to convert to 8-bit, throwing away all of that information before I could return to the menu and then choose either index color or grayscale. And if I wanted to go to bitmap, I would need to go to grayscale first and then choose image mode in order to access bitmap. So for the most part, choosing the correct bit depth comes down to the size versus the flexibility and quality when you're editing your images. An 8-bit image will always be smaller than 16-bit. However, 16 and 32-bit images contain more information and can produce higher quality results when large manipulations are made to the files. I prefer to work in 16-bit whenever possible. The larger file seems like a fair trade-off for more colors and tonal information when making edits to my images. If you're using the exercise files for this course, you'll notice that many of them are in 8-bit, but that's just to save on file size. There's a number of brush presets that you can use in Photoshop as is, or you can customize them to create the painterly marks that you want to use in Photoshop. I'm going to create a new document at the default Photoshop size and then use Command 0 in order to zoom in. I've got the brush selected, but to reset it, I'm going to right-click on the icon in the options bar and choose Reset Tool. Then I'll click on this icon here, and that's going to show me not only my brush settings, but also my brushes. So my brushes is where I go and find my default brushes. My brush settings enable me to change the options for my brush. Now I'm using a pressure-sensitive tablet, so you might not get the exact same results if you're using a mouse. We're going to take a look at the dry media brushes here. And I'll choose the third one down on the left-hand side here. Now, when I click and paint in my image area, depending on how hard I press with the pen, I'm going to get a different kind of stroke. Whereas if I'm painting with the mouse here, which I'll switch to, and I paint, you'll notice that I'm always getting kind of this solid stroke. Now, I could change the opacity of this, but again, that's going to be on a per stroke basis, and it's really not the same effect that I'm getting using the pressure-sensitive tablet. Let's take a look at a few other presets here. I'm going to use the wet media brushes, and I'm going to select this wet blender. And you'll notice that it actually has a different tool icon here. So it's switched from the brush tool to the smudge tool. And now when I paint over this area, I'm getting kind of this nice little smudge effect. Let's keep moving down and take a look at what's in these special effects brushes. I'll select the third one on the right here, this foliage brush, and now you can see when I paint, it actually looks like I've got a number of different leaves that I'm laying down. If we want to load more preset brushes, we can use the flyout menu here and choose to either load the legacy brushes, or we can even get more brushes online. I'm going to choose the legacy brushes because when I load these, I'm going to have access to a number of different natural media brush tips, which we'll take a look at in the brush settings. I'll click on the Brush Settings tab, and I'm going to start scrolling down until I start seeing some of these icons right here. But before I select one of them, let's go ahead and just return to kind of a more normal computational brush because I want to take off all those other settings. So I'll just choose this soft round pressure size, then go to Brush Settings, and then scroll down to find one of these natural media bristle tips. As soon as I select one of them, we actually get a 3D preview over here on the left-hand side that'll show me what the brush would look like. On the right, I've got my bristle qualities, so I can change this from maybe a round point brush to a round blunt brush. There are a number of different options, and then we can come in and we can say that we want maybe fewer or more bristles. We can change the length and the thickness and the stiffness and the angle, and we get a preview right down here of what that brush would look like. So now I can go ahead and start painting in the image area. But let's take a look at what tool I have selected. It's actually the mixer brush tool. So I'm going to switch back to just the regular brush tool and then choose brushes again to return to that soft round brush. All right, under brush settings, again, I'll just scroll down until I see one of those natural media bristle tips. And now when I paint, I get something very, very different because I'm using the regular brush tool. So not only is it important what preset you select, but also what tool you have chosen in your toolbar. All right, let's move on to some of the other options here. If I scroll down a little bit, we see a bunch of tips that look like they're airbrushes. And if I select one of those and we look at the preview down here, we get an estimate of what it's going to look like when I paint in the image area. But we can also change the options such as distortion and granularity or the spatter size or the spatter amount. Now to me that actually looks like it's a little bit clogged, so I'm going to decrease the spatter amount and I get a brush stroke like this. Again, unfortunately, if I'm using a mouse, which I'll switch to right now, it's going to be a very different brush stroke. All right, I'll scoot down a little bit more to one of these brush tips. These are the erodible points, and we can choose from a variety of different ones to start with. I'll start with the point, and then I'm going to make it a very soft brush just so that you can see if we're watching the 3D preview here, and I start painting with this, you can actually watch as the tip of it erodes. Now it's very easy to resharpen it. I'll just click Sharpen Tip. All right, let's scroll down a little bit more. There's a number of tips that are custom tips. This one's been in Photoshop for a long time. It's this dune grass. So let's do a quick edit and fill, just to fill our canvas with white, and then we'll start painting with this. So if I just paint a stroke, it's actually quite boring because it just paints the same custom tip over and over again. But let's take a look at some of the different brush settings. I can go to my shape dynamics, click on that, and then I can change the size. So now as I paint with this brush, I get different size pieces of grass. I can set that pressure sensitivity as well. So now as I press lighter or heavier, I can get those different sizes. We could also change the angle jitter or the roundness jitter, but then it's kind of look like it's kind of been cut down like hay. So I'll leave those up. We can scatter them if we want to. I can scatter along a single or both axis. And again, all of these settings have the option for pin pressure. I can also set it to pin tilt and stylus wheel and rotation. So a lot of things to explore when you have time. This is just a basic overview. All right, we'll pick color dynamics because this is quite fun to play with. I can jitter the hue, the saturation, or the brightness. So hue is going to jitter, but you'll notice nothing happened the first time. I actually have to pick up the pen and paint again. So it's jittering it, but only every time that I do a paint stroke. If I want to apply it per tip, then I will check that. And now just with a single paint stroke, we can see that that hue is being jittered as I paint. Of course, we don't have to do hue. We could do saturation or brightness or whatever we want. Now I'm going to return to the brush presets for just a moment. And I'm going to select that chunky charcoal brush preset that we were looking at a moment ago. Then I'll click on brush settings, and this is a great way to figure out what attributes were used in order to create that brush. So if I click on texture, for example, we can see that this brush actually creates a texture, and this is the texture up here. If I wanted to change it, I could go ahead and select it and then select the texture here, or use the gear icon and load additional textures. If I paint with it, we can see the texture. And if I decided to do something like invert the texture, I could see if that gives me a different result. We can also change the scale of the texture or the brightness or the contrast, and we can see it update right below in that preview area. So if I want that same effect but a little bit lighter, I can just adjust those settings. There's also an option for a dual brush. This means I'm actually taking a brush and then painting through another brush tip. So if I select a different brush tip, maybe I'll pick one that looks like it's really gloppy. I'm going to look for something here that seems pretty obvious. Maybe something like this will do it. Of course, I could also change the blend mode here. So I could change it to multiply and see how that affects the brush tip. All of these different options, and just vary either the texture or the look of the brush as I paint it. If you do make a custom brush that you really like, you'll probably want to save that so that you can come back to it later. So at the bottom of the brush settings panel, I'm going to click on the plus icon here, and I'll just add JK to the very beginning of this. And you can choose whether or not to capture the brush size, include tool settings, so that would be things like opacity and flow, and whether or not you want to include your foreground color. I'll leave those two off for now and click OK. And I return to the brushes panel. We can see there's the new brush preset that I just created. So as you can see, there are a lot of controls available in the brush settings that you can take the time to explore on your own. If you want to learn more about painting tools such as the mixer brush or custom brushes or painting along a path, be sure to watch my other videos in the painting sections of the Photoshop Essential Training for Design. We're going to take the next few minutes to see how to quickly change the size and the edge hardness of the brush, as well as change a few additional attributes, which will make you much more efficient when painting in Photoshop. I'll start by creating a new document. I'll select the default Photoshop size and open that, and then use Command 0 in order to zoom in. Now to select the brush, I'll tap the B key, and I'm going to right-click on the brush icon in the options bar just to reset the tool. To the right, we have a preview as well as the size of the brush, and if we click on the downward pointing arrow, we can access the brush preset picker. Here I can change attributes such as the size of the brush, the hardness of the brush, as well as the shape of the brush and the angle. Below that, we have our recently used brushes, so yours might look different from mine. Below that are a number of different default presets that we can access at any time. I'm going to begin by selecting the soft round brush, and then I can tap the return key or the enter key in order to close the preset picker. Now, if I want to change the brush size, there are a variety of different ways to do this. I can tap the right bracket key in order to increase the brush size, or tap the left bracket key to decrease the brush size. I can also just hold the bracket keys in order to quickly get a larger or smaller brush size. But maybe a more visual way to change the size would be to hold down the Option and the Control key on the Mac, or on Windows, you would Alt and then right-click, and you drag either left or right to change the diameter or the size of the brush, and you can drag up or down to change the hardness of the brush. If you want to access the brush preset picker, regardless of where you are on screen, you can use the context-sensitive menus, so either Command-click on Mac or just right-click, and then select the different settings that you want and tap Enter to hide it again. Let's go ahead and select a color. I'll use the Color panel here, and I just want to pick a nice blue color. Then I'll start painting. One of the things to notice is that as I paint, we see the size of the cursor, but the paint actually extends beyond the cursor. I'm going to right-click to access the brush preset picker, and I'll set the hardness to 0, and then I'll paint. And you can see that the paint is actually spraying outside of that circle. So it's just important to know that it sprays beyond. If I right-click again, and set the hardness all the way up to 100%, and I click, now we can see that it's constrained to only paint within that circle. If I want to paint a straight line, I can click and then hold down the Shift key, and that'll constrain it to a straight line. We're seeing a little bit of a jump between the individual paint strokes, and that's just because of the spacing that I have set. In order to change the spacing, I would need to click on the icon that would show our brush settings and our brushes. In the brush settings, I could decrease the spacing, and now when I click and drag, I'm going to get a nice smooth stroke. The only drawback to decreasing the spacing is that if you're trying to paint really quickly with a very large brush, it can be very processor intensive. There might be a delay between the time you make your gesture or mark on the paper and when Photoshop lays down that stroke. If I ever need to connect the dots between two areas, I can click once in order to set down a paint stroke, hold down the Shift key, and then click again, and Photoshop will draw a straight line between those 2 points. All right, let's use the Edit menu, and I'll choose Fill, and let's just fill the canvas with white again. Let's take a look at a few of the additional options in the options bar. We can change the opacity for the brush, and I can do this numerically. As long as I have the brush tool selected and I tap the 5 key, I'll get 50%, or if I tap 6, I'll get 60%. If you tap quickly, like 4-5, you'll get 45%. So now when I click and paint, I'm only going to get 45% of my foreground color. If I click and paint over it, you can see that I slowly start building up the paint strokes. If I want to return to 100%, I just tap the 0 key. Now the flow is a little bit different from the opacity. The flow setting is going to control the speed at which the paint is laid down. So I imagine it's like pressing the nozzle of a can of spray paint. Are you pressing the nozzle just a little bit, or are you pressing it all the way down? So with the flow at 100%, you are spraying it at 100% as quickly as possible. But when I move the flow down, now it's going to take a while in order to build that up. I'm going to move it all the way down to 2% just to make sure that we can see. And I'm also going to get a softer edge brush. So I'll right-click and change the hardness down to 0. I'll tap Return to dismiss that. And now, as I click and paint, we can watch as it slowly builds up because I have the flow set down so low. All right, I'll set the flow back up to 100%. And we need to talk a little bit about smoothing. So as you make longer strokes, it can be helpful to use the smoothing slider. I'm going to get a little smaller brush by using the left bracket key. And you can see that I can't really create a super smooth paint stroke with the mouse. But if I increase the smoothing, and now I try to paint, we can see that I can get a much smoother stroke over a long area with that smoothing set up higher. There's also a really cool feature with smoothing, and you can access it under the gear icon. It's called pulled string mode. I'll select that, and now when I click to lay down my dot, you'll notice that I can move anywhere within that magenta circle and nothing happens. It's not until I actually press beyond that circle that Photoshop will start drawing the line. Then if I want to change directions, I can go ahead and move anywhere within that circle. And again, it's not until I pull that string that Photoshop will change the directions. So this can be really helpful if, like me, you don't have a very steady hand and you need to change the direction. All right, another way that paint strokes can interact with one another is by using the blend mode. I'll get a little bit bigger of a brush using that right bracket key. And I'm going to change the opacity to 50% by tapping the 5 key. And then I'll change the blend mode to multiply. Let's also use Edit, Fill, and just fill this with white again. Now I'll make one paint stroke, and let's go ahead and set the smoothing back down to 10% and also turn off the pulled string mode. So I made the one paint stroke, and now I'm going to multiply that paint stroke together every time I click and paint over it. And while the opacity is having an effect, it's also the multiply blend mode that's going to continue to multiply these together even far darker than my foreground color. If I want the opposite effect, I could choose screen, and now every time I paint, it's actually lightening that area. It's almost as if I'm painting with bleach. All right, I'm going to fill the background one more time, but this time I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut. I'm going to hold down the Command key on Mac or the Control key on Windows and tap the Delete key, and that will fill with my background color. Now, if you're planning on doing a lot of painting in Photoshop, and you don't have to necessarily be a painter, you might be working with a lot of masks. Well, I would recommend that if you are, that you invest in a pressure-sensitive tablet. So I'm going to switch over. I've got a Wacom tablet here that I'm going to start painting with. And the biggest advantage here is when you're working with a mouse and you do one paint stroke, you can change the size and the opacity between each paint stroke, but not during the paint stroke. So I've got my pressure-sensitive pen now, and I'm going to set the blend mode back up to normal. I'll bring the opacity back up to 100%, and let's take a look at some of those presets in the brush preset picker. I'm going to make this a little bit larger so we see 2 rows of presets here. You'll notice that we've got soft round and hard round presets, but then the next set, they actually vary in size, and we can see that the stroke will taper. So I can select the soft round pressure size or the hard round pressure size, and I'm going to get pressure sensitivity of the size of my brush. So even though I've got a relatively large brush, as I start painting, depending on the pressure that I lay down, I can get a large brush, or I can back off on the pressure and I can get a small brush. If I return to the preset picker and we change the preset to opacity, now when I paint very lightly, I'm just going to lay down a little bit of paint, but as I press harder, I can lay down more and more paint. I can also choose to vary the opacity as well as the size at one time. And I can either do that by selecting another brush, or let's just move this out of the way. And I can click on this icon right here, which is going to override any of the settings that are applied to the pen and give me pressure sensitivity. And I can also enable this option right here, which will override the settings of the selected preset and give me pressure sensitivity for size. So now I can start painting lightly and I get a smaller brush and not a lot of ink. But as I press harder, not only do I get a larger brush, but I also get more ink laid down. So as you can see, this pressure sensitivity with the tablet is really an advantage. And there you go. That's how you can quickly select a brush and change the essential settings like size and opacity, flow, and smoothing for the painting tools in Photoshop.